Hello, my name is Dr. Courtney Cogburn. I'm an associate professor here at Columbia University in New York City, and I'm delighted to join you for devcom 2020. I am bummed that I'm not able to join you in the beautiful Cologne in person, but nonetheless excited to be able to address you all today regarding the role of XR technologies in the fight for social justice, and more specifically, the fight against racism. The remarks that I've prepared today have really focused on three different buckets of ideas. The first is thinking about what we mean when we say XR for good, XR for justice. The second is to think about frameworks that we can reference when we're thinking about the meaning of racism, anti-Black racism, and anti-racism as a context for understanding how these constructs, these phenomena function in our societies globally, and thinking of that as an important context for us to be effective in the fight against those issues. The third is using work that I've helped develop along with the team at Stanford University, using VR to address issues of racism and using the experience that we've created as a case study for how we might use these technologies in a way that helps us think about the fight for social justice. So let's get started. The first question I raise is what we mean when we say things like XR for good. I get the sense that people often rely upon good intentions, that myself and my team had good intentions to represent a community or a narrative or an issue, and that intention is good enough. And what I would argue is that that intention is not good enough. That intention is insufficient and can often lead to harm and damage in ways that you clearly didn't intend to put out right into the world through your work. But what I would suggest is that we have to really unpack what we mean by good. Not just intention, but does good mean bringing joy? Does good mean repairing harm? Does good mean really contributing to significant and meaningful change in a community around a particular issue? I think that there are a variety of ways that we might think about being good and doing good, but that it requires conscious decision making around what not only our intentions are, but around how we hope to have impact, and thinking carefully about the processes we need to engage to help maximize the chances that we actually have the sorts of positive impact that we had hoped to have. I want to also make a distinction between ethics and justice. So when we think about emerging technologies, when we think about XR, we often focus on ethics. So we think about what are our guidelines around preventing harm? How do we avoid deliberately harming one group more than another in the technologies that we're developing? How are we handling their data? How are we dealing with privacy, etc.? What I forward is that we also need to be thinking about justice. And justice is not only about avoiding harm, justice is about repairing harms that have already occurred, repairing disadvantages that have already been embedded into society in various ways, and trying to build bridges to help us overcome those disadvantages. Specifically, though, there's a need to focus and have a reckoning around racism in our framing of ethics and our framing of justice, and thinking about the role of XR in this particular fight related to social justice. When we think about racism, it's important for us to not only focus on the individual exchanges and experiences that we may have with people, being called a name, being followed in a store, being harassed in some way, which are all important manifestations of racism. But what I would push us to do is to think about racism as systems, as policies, as norms, as practices that create systemic disadvantage and advantage on the basis of race. When we think about anti-Black racism, we're thinking about those very same systems, but that specifically disadvantage and substantially disadvantage people of African descent or people who fall on the spectrum of Blackness. What I mean by that is that we have these negative sentiments that occur globally around Blackness and disdain and wanting to distance ourselves from darker skin, those who represent darker skin spectrums, skin hues on a spectrum, wanting to acknowledge the ways in which those sorts of attitudes and beliefs and practices manifest globally. So the ways in which we might privilege particular skin tones or want to maintain a particular skin tone using products that privilege particular skin tones, thinking about those in our societies who are most disadvantaged, who are most oppressed, consistently around the world are those who have darker skin, not exclusively. But this notion of Black being bad, darker being bad, is something that is manifested globally, which we could unpack the historical context and why that has occurred. But what I ask you to consider is the ways in which it's showing up in your society, perhaps invisibly, visibly, that shape our beliefs around value of whiteness or lighter skin tones, and our value or disregard or disvalue, undervaluing of darker skin tones and those who we would categorize as Black. We also want to consider a few specific terms when we're trying to understand, again, this context of racism. And not to stay with my professor hat too long, but again, I'm trying to make the argument that we need to understand how racism functions in order to be adequately positioned to fight against racism, to be meaningfully anti-racist. So when we think about white supremacy, for instance, which is another key component of how racism functions in society, we don't only want to think about we don't only want to think about fringe groups in our society, but instead think about the ways in which we have privileged whiteness in our cultural norms, in various aspects of our societal systems, as being the norm, as being our definition of good, as being our reference point for humanity. Again, we could spend all day unpacking and talking about that, but in your own reflection, thinking carefully about how white supremacy, this notion that white is better than other things, and anything that's not white or proximal to white becomes a deviation from the norm, to think carefully about how that shows up in your society and in your own beliefs and in your own work. I'd also like you to think about the distinction between identity and positionality. So when we're thinking about identity, we're thinking about your personal sense of self, the ways in which you identify around race or gender or other orientations like sexuality. If you're thinking about your preferences for sports or hobbies, those are all parts of the rich tapestry that makes up how you see yourself, which is incredibly important. But this is quite distinct from positionality. When we're thinking about positionality, we're thinking about, how do I present to the world? How do people see me, regardless of how I see myself? How do my physical markers of position give someone a sense of how I might be treated or impact the ways in which I might be treated? So again, thinking about this idea of proximity to whiteness or proximity to Blackness, depending on where you fall on that spectrum, again, independent of the labels that you might apply to yourself, those physical indicators to the outside world can shape your lived experiences, can shape the ways in which you're perceived and treated, that ultimately have impact on your life and life outcomes. So again, to think more specific about proximity to whiteness, if we're thinking about white and Black, let's say, as anchors on a spectrum, what I would like you to do is to consider where you fall. Are you closer to what we might call Black, even if you wouldn't identify as being Black? Or do you fall closer to on the spectrum to white? Again, even if you wouldn't identify or personally label yourself as white, where do you fall on the spectrum? And given where you fall on that spectrum, how might your experiences, your lived experiences, be changed and altered based on your position on that spectrum? It's also important to acknowledge that your position on that spectrum, or where you place yourself on that spectrum in terms of your position, might shift depending on where you live. If you are in Cologne versus Paris versus Rio de Janeiro, depending on where you fall on that spectrum, you may place yourself in different places. And even in more nuanced ways, being in your neighborhood or with your family, as opposed to being at work or at school. So again, these nuances and the dynamism in how we think about these things are important to consider. It's also a critical point to think about moving beyond your individual designation as being racist or not. And what I'm asking you to do is to not think so much about whether you're racist or not. That really becomes a more narcissistic investment for many people. They're focused on whether you think I'm a good person or not, or whether you think I'm racist or not. And what I'm asking you to do instead of that, in lieu of that, is to think about your relationship to whiteness and to racism and to anti-Blackness, and to think about that in an honest and open way. Again, anyone who's interested in engaging in anti-racism or the fight against racism has to come to terms with what these constructs mean that I'm presenting to you and what your relationship to them are. Also, again, your focus on being designated as am I racist or not, and focused on that as opposed to being anti-racist. Anti-racism is not so much a label that you can apply to yourself, but it's an orientation, it's an action. It's reflected in your behaviors, it's reflected in policy, and it's not so much about an individual and who gets a sticker indicating that they're anti-racist or not, or racist or not. It's more so about the work and the ways in which you engage issues of racism and how you fight against racism. And what I argue is that in XR, we have a sphere of influence through our storytelling and the ways in which we represent narratives, the ways in which we develop technologies, the way we build our teams, the ways in which we try to create access and pathways to using and developing these technologies can all be grounded in a practice of anti-racism. So what do we mean by anti-racism? More specifically, we're thinking about acknowledging that white supremacy and racism are embedded in our systems. Again, often invisibly, often in ways that we just accept, this is just the way things are. This is just the way things operate. This is what normal means. This is what good means. This is what healthy means. In ways that if we take a step back and start to unpack that a bit more, we can see that we've used whiteness as a standard for determining what many of those norms are. Anti-racism anticipates that that's true, and that in the existence of those things, we are systemically disadvantaging those who are not proximal to white. Because they are not proximal to what we consider normal, they're not proximal to what we consider good, that we in turn build in disadvantage. Those disadvantages are what we would call racism. And anti-racism accepts that as a default and actively works against the inherent tendency for those systems to function in a way that advantages those who are on the white end of the spectrum and disadvantages those who are on the Black end of the spectrum. So in thinking about my experiences in a global context, I'm reminded of a recent trip to Europe. In referring to myself as the psychologist, I'm a psychologist, social worker, and public health scholar. When a psychologist walked into a bar and had a libation-fueled discussion with two white men in Amsterdam. And one of these white men said to me, in response to my work and my experiences around racism, "That's utterly ridiculous. Racism isn't real. You're playing a victim." And I use this as a reference for really what has become a motivation for my work. And certainly I was engaged in this work before I encountered this particular person in a bar in Amsterdam. But it represents the ways in which white people in particular misunderstand what racism is. And what I mean by misunderstand or don't understand is really not listening, willfully ignoring, opting out of acknowledging, actively dismissing, reducing to a problem of the past, etc., etc. So my work has been focused on trying to create an experience that moves beyond data, that moves beyond science, and not really beyond it. Those things are actually still integrated into the work, but really trying to create an experience that helps more people connect with the significance of racism in a more visceral and personal way. I like this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates from his book Between the World and Me, because it captures so much of this essence of what we were trying to represent in our work. And I'll just read it briefly. But for all of our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it lodges brains, blocks airways, tips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must always remember the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. And what I'm asking you all to consider today is that racism is not a figment of our imaginations. It is not something that has only occurred in the past. It is not something that is uniquely a problem in the United States. Racism is something that has colored almost every context around the globe. Anti-Blackness, notions of whiteness, who's good, who's bad, etc., and the ways in which that has been embedded, again, through our cultures and systems, is not only a historical phenomenon, it functions in a contemporary manner. It continues to shape the ways in which we function in our societies. It continues to shape opportunity. And it's important for all of us globally to accept this and deal with it more explicitly. I hope that what the global protest in particular, this massive global movement, indicates to more of us is that this is a problem that we all share and that we should all be engaging and fighting against. So I want to focus on A Thousand Cut Journey, which is a virtual reality piece, again, that I led the creation of as an example of how we tried to do this. So keeping in mind what is racism, what is anti-racism, keeping in mind this distinction between ethics and justice, and keeping in mind the intention of doing good using XR technologies and moving beyond intention to be more strategic and sophisticated in the ways that we're trying to achieve good. And so this project was an exploratory effort. I'm not holding it up as the perfect example of how to do this work, but certainly as an example through which we've learned so much about how to leverage these technologies and things that we may do differently as a result of the work that we've developed. So the premise of our project was that achieving social justice, and specifically racial justice, but social justice in any form, requires that we understand and address racism. Again, I don't have the time to fully unpack that, but I hope that the context that I've provided leading up to this point gives you some sense of why tackling racism directly is important to any notion of doing good, to any idea of ethics, to any idea of justice. We need to explicitly consider the function of racism. That doesn't mean that racism is more important than other issues, but it is an argument that it is core to our understanding of oppression and dominance globally. So the project is really something that started given my interest in having people walk in the shoes of someone who's experiencing racism. And I should say, and I often say when I give talks and interviews about this work, is that I had never used virtual reality at the time that I approached my colleague to collaborate with me and to write the proposal to fund this work. And I have this Lionel Richie poster here because I reached out to Jeremy Bailenson, who is a scholar at Stanford University, who's been working in this space for a very long time. Cold call. I didn't know him. He didn't know me. I, again, barely knew what virtual reality was, but I reached out and said, hey, might you be interested in delving more deeply into racism using VR? And I'm just formulating my ideas, but are you interested in working together? And lucky enough, he was interested and his team was interested. And so we embarked on this journey together. And an important piece of what we were trying to achieve in this work was as much about process as the end product. In developing this work, we engaged in what I and others describe as a transdisciplinary process. We knew that we needed to draw from multiple disciplinary perspectives in order to develop a meaningful and authentic piece of work. So in addition to the racial, ethnic, and gender diversity of our team, we also incorporated perspectives from computer science. We used creative technologists, psychologists, social workers, etc., all coming together to develop this work. Now, here's a key point about transdisciplinary process. One, it's non-hierarchical. So it does not assume that one discipline or one perspective is more important than another. Through a transdisciplinary process, computer science is not more important than social work. Computer science is not more important than psychology. We're really thinking about each of these disciplinary perspectives playing a significant role in meeting this goal. It's also not a consultation type of model. So it's not a model where I have an idea and I go and hire someone who can do this piece, and I have a meeting with someone who focuses on that thing, and I get a little bit of information from them, and then I go back into my lab and brew something up. Through this type of process, you're really privileging the importance of having those different perspectives at the table from the very beginning, all with voice and power, in a way where you're all coming together to solve the same problem. The expectation here is that you wouldn't reach a particular solution to a problem without that group of people at the table, as opposed to, say, identifying a problem based on your own perspective and then going out to consult different people to help you solve that problem. So it really is a merging of ideas. It's an integration of thought and process to try and create something new as a result of that group of people coming together. So the target audience, so I talked about quite blatantly white people not understanding racism, and they were very much the target for this particular piece. And we were thinking specifically about white liberals in a US context. So when I say that, people say, wait, white liberals, those are the people who are, at the protest and fighting in the streets. And aren't you preaching to the choir? Why don't you spend more time thinking about, the people on the far right? And what I argue is I'm absolutely talking to the choir, because people who espouse beliefs of racial justice and racial equity don't always understand those problems, and thus can be ineffective in that fight. Or have a misalignment between what they say their beliefs are, the symbols that they invest in terms of being liberal and down and woke, and their actions. So there can often be a disconnect between what you say you believe and then what you actually do. So I am targeting this group in an attempt to better enable what I argue is an important group in society in the fight for racial justice, better equip them to engage in more meaningful and in deeper ways. So the question that is really driving this work is, among this group of people that espouses beliefs of justice and equity and all of that, how do we help them to develop more substantive knowledge and to engage in a more meaningful way? To achieve this, we examined a range of issues. Again, when I proposed this project, I really presented a scaffold. I presented an idea that I think experiencing racism in virtual reality in some form might be powerful. And I asked the funders to invest in a process that I can't decide on the solution because I'm a transdisciplinary scholar. I'm investing in a transdisciplinary process. I'm investing in a solution that requires a group of people to come together to create and develop this solution together. So we started with just brainstorming a range of ideas. We tested out different types of virtual reality technology, so 360 video as opposed to where we landed with a digital immersive experience. We really thought carefully about how we're crafting scenes and threads and how do we build authenticity into the narrative in a way that doesn't become reductive or silly or even gamified in the way that we were representing this really complex phenomena. We also ended up using 2D rotoscoping techniques to help us capture human figures and bodies and how we integrated them into the work, and really tried to explore ways in which how do we maintain interactivity while integrating rotoscoped actors into a digital environment. And this was important for a variety of reasons in terms of allowing us to introduce multiple figures in a space in a short, and introduce multiple figures in the digital space, and to achieve that in a short amount of time related to the piece and achieve the interactivity that was important in the work. And when we're thinking about interactivity, we were really building on an existing body of research developed by Jeremy Bailenson, Mel Slater, many others who have thought about how do you create the most meaningful embodied experiences in digital environments. And a lot of that work reflects the significance of using the body, not just observing in that body. So getting down on your knees and putting your hands up in response to the police, or having the actors, the humans in the environment interact with you in various ways were important aspects of developing this interactive component. So where we ended was a multi-phase experience in the from the perspective of a single person. So we put you into the digital shoes of a character named Michael Sterling, whose life you embody as a child, adolescent, and as an adult, and you're experiencing racism in different forms across across time and across multiple contexts. So this was important because it allowed us, if you think back to that first slide I showed with the whiteboard and the many ideas that we represented, this allowed us to capture many different elements and aspects of racism and how it might be experienced. But to also capture that this is not something that just happens once. It's not just someone calling you a name when you were a teenager or the one time you had a negative encounter with the police. It's something that happens very early in life and something that you carry with you across the life course. And we wanted to tap into some of that nuance in the piece. So in the first scene, you are a young Michael Sterling in an elementary school classroom. We have you look at yourself in a mirror at various points in the experience. You're able to see your hands. You can move your hands around. You see that you have small brown hands. In this first scene, we actually have you sit down on the floor if you're able, to give you a sense of feeling small and feeling like a child. You're playing with blocks. You can stack the blocks and throw the blocks, and you're interacting with children in the scene, children who are taunting you and end up using very racialized language in a way that really reflects that really reflects the ways in which children pick up on and use these sorts of engage in racism from a very young age. So the children in the scene, for instance, are sort of encouraging you to throw the block, and they're saying, Michael, throw the fireball, throw the scary black fireball. Black is always the scariest color. So again, reflecting this sense of anti-Black racism, associating negativity with Blackness, associating Blackness with Michael, and linking those two together from a very young age. We actually goad you into throwing the block. And so once you do that, it triggers a white female teacher who's off to the side, who enters the scene and sort of chides you for being dangerous and potentially hurting someone. So even though the other children in the scene are engaged in the exact same behavior, they're also throwing and tossing blocks. You're the one who's being targeted. And it's important to note, and I often emphasize this when talking about this work, is that this is based on not just our gut instincts or even our personal stories. This is based in part on empirical data that has documented, in a U.S. context in particular, differences by race, and Black boys in particular being disciplined more harshly when they're engaged in the same behaviors as other children in the classroom. And we use that sort of empirical data in guiding the content throughout the piece. But we don't only privilege empirical data. We also believe that those personal narratives and stories are critical and add richness to how these things manifest. So we conducted interviews and referenced other sorts of anecdotal type data where people are sharing narratives and experiences around racism at different ages, and use that to help complement what we were developing in the script and the narrative, and how we were representing different aspects of the environment even as an important piece of what we were trying to achieve as well. So it really is a combination of empirical data as well as personal narratives being integrated to represent these experiences. In the second scene, you see yourself in a mirror again. You transition to an older version of yourself. You're now an adolescent, you're a teenager, and you start off in your bedroom where you're able to walk around and throw a basketball, and you see a news alert pop on your screen that an unarmed Black teen has been killed by a white police officer. In doing that, again, we're trying to do a couple of things. So being in your bedroom, you can see your snowboard and posters and the music that you like. We're trying to create depth to this character. This is not just a person who's experiencing racism. This is a person who lives a full life with interests and parents and siblings, etc. But what we're emphasizing is these experiences of racism. We're also capturing that, again, it's not just the direct encounters with racism being called a name. By having the news alert pop up, we're also trying to represent the ways in which these exposures to racism happen just sort of around you in your day-to-day experiences. Logging onto Twitter, something might pop up in your news feed that's reminding you yet again that people who look like you, people who walk in bodies like yours, are considered a threat and dangerous. And even if it doesn't happen to you directly, even if that particular incident didn't happen to you, it's a reminder of the threats that exist in society. You receive a call from your friend, a white friend, Adam. So you pick up the cell phone, and Adam says that he's waiting downstairs. And when you go downstairs and you're about to leave, heading to your basketball game, your mother is watching the news, your Black mother, and she's asking you to change because the police are looking for someone who's dressed similarly to you. She's on the couch, she's watching the news, she's noticing that there's activity in the neighborhood and asks you to change. Again, we're trying to capture this sense that a mother has to worry about what shirt you're wearing when you leave the house in an attempt to keep you safe. This is a reflection of this sort of nuance that we wanted to capture in the piece. We're thinking about not only, again, these direct encounters with actually experiencing police violence, but even having to anticipate and plan for a police encounter. Later in the scene, you actually go onto the street. Your neighbors are encouraging you to have a great game and cheering you on. Again, we're trying to represent add some richness to the neighborhood and how people experience this particular community. And while you're standing there talking with a neighbor, a police car pulls up and 3 officers jump out and ask you to get down on your knees and put your hands up. And in fact, they don't ask you, they command you very harshly. They're cursing, they're yelling. There's the assumption that you are the person they're looking for, even though you are not, and you're just standing there on the sidewalk. And so in the image that I showed you earlier around interactivity, we really want you, the user, to get down on your knees and to put your hands up in a way that helps you embody this experience in the moment. There's a moment in this scene where the neighbors are yelling and yelling at the officers and telling them to leave you alone and that you didn't do anything wrong. And the officers are yelling, and there's a moment where all of that sound cuts off and the lights go off. It's just dark. And you hear your mother's voice saying, just do what you have to do to get home alive. And again, we're representing nuance, right? The script that many Black parents have to give their children. And this is not only a U.S. phenomenon, but many Black parents have to give their children in an attempt to help keep them safe in a world that sees them as violent and as a threat. In the final scene, you transition to a young adult version of yourself where you're in a workplace setting and you're applying for a job. And in this scene, we really want you to experience being dismissed and feeling invisible. The interviewer ignores you, assumes that the white candidate is the candidate that he was most excited to meet from a particular university. He's corrected that you're actually the candidate from that university. But he says, oh, but you don't mind if I take him back first, do you? So in this scene, we were really playing around with how do you really capture some of those subtleties? The language that many people use is microaggressions. So how do we capture some of those subtle exchanges where you feel dismissed and disregarded and unseen and undervalued? And that's really challenging to do, where we're trying to help you experience the absence of something as opposed to a police encounter, such as the one that you experience in the second scene. So I think this is a really interesting example of trying to play around with some variation and interaction in VR. So what have we learned? We have conducted several empirical studies and are actively analyzing, writing up data. We've done this both in a laboratory setting, but also in public spaces where we're at events and collecting data while people are in the headset, of course, with their permission, with their consent. So we're going to have a rich tapestry of data, qualitative data, quantitative data, experimental data that will give us a sense of what effect are we having on people when they go through experiences like this. Some other things that we've learned that I thought might be important for those of you who are engaging in XR, VR for good type work, who are thinking about how do I have meaningful social impact in the work that I'm developing. So I think when you're focused on social justice and social impact work, you really have to lead with the issue in the community that you're trying to, or communities that you're trying to represent. It's not about the technology. It's not about the cool technological thing that you can achieve, the latest, greatest technique. It really is about doing justice in a way that, again, is authentic and meaningful to the issue that you're trying to represent. I also think that hot topics can distract people from their purpose and intent. You really have to focus on, why are you doing this? Why are you engaging in this work? Is it because people are talking about racism now, or I was part of a cool protest and I want to capture that? Or are you really intent on focusing on what that protest might represent, or the significance of the issue in society? And do you fully understand that issue? Which I think kind of comes to the point of, are you the person who should be telling that particular story? Or do you or your team have the skills and perspectives necessary to actually capture the complexity and richness of the issue that you're trying to represent? This again goes back to the significance of a transdisciplinary approach, acknowledging that your intent to do good may not be sufficient and that you may need to supplement one, you should question whether you're the one who should be pursuing that particular project, but you may also want to consider whether you should supplement your team with perspectives and points of views in a way where they really have power and can really contribute to the development of the work that helps you reach a deeper, more meaningful place with what it is that you're trying to develop. Also, to be willing to iterate, that where you start is certainly not where you end up, and that you need to shift gears. How you've decided to pursue a project and proceed may ultimately not be the way to go. You may have started with a particular team with a certain intention, you had ideas, and then let's say you decided to engage in this process and consult people who had different points of view, and what they're telling you is inconsistent with the way that you were proceeding. You have to be willing to shift gears. You have to be willing to not say, well, we'll make some small tweaks, thank you for your input, and really start to think about, are we disregarding the expertise and perspectives of people who we should be listening to in a way that can help us develop this work in a more meaningful way? This really is about exploration. We're all thinking about how to achieve this work and do this work. And so there's no magic pill. VR is not magically special. XR in general is not magically special. It has a lot of potential to be powerful and compelling, but that really requires deeper exploration. And again, I think is best achieved in terms of its power, is best achieved when we have rich teams engaging in the development of content and in the technologies themselves as a collective. And also that just sort of accepting that your intent may not bear out in the data. I intended to shift attitudes and beliefs and behavior in particular ways, and while that's bearing out in our data in some ways, it's not in others. And so that should be a learning process. That should be a learning process in terms of are the data, were our methods really reflecting what it is that we were trying to assess and measure? If those methods were on target, then what is it about the work that we developed that's not doing what we hoped it would do? And again, iterating and learning and further exploring to try and reach new and deeper points. And again, coming back to this idea that good intentions are insufficient. So your intentions to do good can actually cause harm and damage. So just a set of questions to consider as you pursue this kind of work. What are the implications of your work? Who and why should you be leading this work? What are your ethics around storytelling, particularly around stories that are not your own? And are the communities being represented, the issues being represented, the communities that are most affected by the issues that you're trying to represent, are they also a part of your process? Are they a part of developing the content? Not in a sort of a consultative type of way, but in a role that is integrated into your team from the very beginning of the work that you're developing. I think these are important questions to consider as you or others may be pursuing social impact type work through XR. I have a colleague here, and I can never remember her name because I actually don't know her very well, but she shared something with me that was quite impactful in terms of how I approach my work, which is this idea that there are those who solve the problems of their disciplines and those who solve the problems of the world. And those who solve the problems of the world really need a particular orientation. There needs to be a degree of humility that you alone, your team, your small team alone may not have all that you need to get the job done, to take on these really complicated social issues. That you have to engage in a practice of not only ethics, but justice, not only avoiding harm, but how can I leverage what we're creating and doing to avoid harm, to achieve equity around the issue that I'm trying to address. And that really requires engaging in an anti-racist and anti-oppressive practice, not just trying to be a good person or having good intentions, but actively considering how the construction of my team, the way I'm framing my questions, the ways in which I'm engaging particular aspects of this issue are shaped by these very systems, right, that embed whiteness and white supremacy and anti-blackness. How do I anticipate that at the outset and decide how I'm going to engage? And that transdisciplinarity is a key piece of this, reaching well beyond your own expertise, the things that you know well and feel competent in, and acknowledging that it's where you feel incompetent, it's where you feel least comfortable, that might represent your biggest blind spots and gaps in your ability to achieve your goal, and that you need to be proactive in filling those gaps in your process, and collaborate and consult across many wells of knowledge and expertise. So thank you for joining me today. I know that these are not easy issues to discuss, and I know that the ways in which we think and talk about this from a U.S. perspective doesn't always translate to a global perspective, but I hope that what I've been able to achieve today is to provide some context around why this might be relevant, why it is relevant, frankly, in a global setting, and at least some guidance for how you might approach this in your work using XR. And so I'll be joining you live for Q&A following this presentation, and I look forward to that discussion. Thank you.